Hello and welcome to Incredible Stories with Nathan Mackey. Today's guest, Jim Barroll, is a 41-year veteran radio broadcaster who is best known for his tenure with 1110 AM WBT Radio in Charlotte, North Carolina. Jim joined me by phone a few days ago to talk about his early love of radio, breaking into the radio business, years as a reporter and news director at the 50,000-watt blowtorch. He reflects on some of the more famous events he covered, as well as shares his insights on what it takes to be a good reporter. Lastly, we'll finish out the interview with his predictions for his favorite baseball team, the Cincinnati Reds. So, Jim, how did you get started in broadcasting?
Well, it was really the result of growing up and listening to the radio. We moved around a great deal, and every time we would move to another market, really, my dad was a college professor, and he moved from one college town to the next. And some of those cities were pretty big, but not all of them. My way of kind of staying in tune with what was going on was through radio. And every time we'd move to a new city, I would turn on the radio to find out where the top 40 music station was. And so I always was very interested in local radio, not really thinking that I would be getting into it, but I think it's just a love of the medium. And ultimately, when I was old enough and I started looking for work while I was in college, I looked around at radio stations, and that's how I got my first radio job, was when I was in college. That was how I got into it. It wasn't that I was actively looking, but it was something that I kept an interest in, and finally, when I was looking for a job, I had another one at the time while I was in school that was not broadcasting. I finally just got a nod, and someone said, yeah, we could use you. So, starting nights and weekends, so that's how I got my start.
What was your first job at the radio station, and what station was it?
Well, my first job was really a summer job. My grandfather lived and my grandmother lived in Trenton, New Jersey, and he knew somebody who had a radio station there in Trenton. And that interesting market, because up there, Trenton is sort of in between these radio powerhouse markets of New York City and Philadelphia. And even so, Trenton had its own radio station. And I don't know how many people actually listened to it. They had room for an intern one summer, and so I asked my grandfather if he could ask that guy to give me a chance, and so I did. I had an opportunity to do that, and went in there and started just doing odd jobs as an intern. It was a paid internship, but very low pay. And I think I worked there for maybe a month and a half one summer, and that was my first radio job. And at the end of it, I ended up doing I think a 2-hour show playing music. At the time, I was maybe 16 years old. That was my first job. Is WAAT station in Trenton, New Jersey, AM station. I don't know if it still exists, but that was my first job. As it turned out, right before the end of my internship, they had an opening. Somebody wanted to take a couple of days off, so they said, let's let Jim do it. It was a great opportunity, and I was nervous, and I had a great time doing it. So that was my first on-air experience up in Trenton, New Jersey.
Through the years, have you done anything to develop your voice or anything like that?
Not really. No, it just came naturally. I was blessed to have I guess what you call a radio voice. My dad was, as I said, a college professor, and so he had this deep, booming voice that I think I inherited from him. His was still more of a bass voice than my own, but I think I was fortunate in that I had an interest in radio, and my voice also worked out so that it sounded okay on radio. So I didn't really have to do anything else for it. It was just there. So I lucked out.
So where did you get your professional training in broadcasting and radio?
Professional training, I guess you could say, was a combination of on-the-job experience, and not up there in New Jersey, but this was after I was at the University of South Carolina, where I was a broadcast journalism major. And that consisted of lots of opportunities to get involved in radio and TV production, not actually on air. I never actually worked for the campus radio station at USC in Columbia, but did have access to studio type work and project. And then later, I was hired part-time at a station in Columbia. It was really my first regular part-time job at WIS Radio in Columbia. While I was still in college, I was a junior, started doing nights and weekends there. And that was really my on-the-job kind of training. That was learning as I went, starting out with some late night and weekend on-air, really just disc jockey work, if you will. But getting exposed to the business there as I went along. And so that was the kind of training that I got, was just learning from other people who were already there and being instructed by the people that had me doing what I was doing.
So talk to me about some of the radio markets you worked in.
Well, there was Trenton, which was very brief, and I was a teenager at that time. Then Columbia, where I really got into radio part-time and then eventually full-time after I graduated when an opening came along. After a few years there, probably about, I'd say, 5 full-time years in Columbia, it looked like there was going to be a change in the ownership group, and I was in the newsroom at that time. Things looked sort of bleak. It looked like they were going to kind of trim the news staff down. So I quickly started looking around and was fortunate to find a job in Orlando, Florida, at a station called WDBO, which is another AM station. And I got the job. I asked my news director in Columbia if he thought it was a good idea for me to leave, and it turns out he knew that they were going to trim the staff. He said, "Yeah, why don't you go? It'd probably be a good idea." And the next day, I accepted the job, and then I think a week later, they announced that a lot of the news people in Columbia were going to be let go. So it was perfect timing. I had already accepted the other job, so I didn't really count as being fired because I'd already got myself another job. Anyway, landed in Orlando, spent 2 fun-filled, very interesting and educational years down there, getting involved in my first job where I was outside of a market where I'd gone to school and sort of done part-time work. And but my wife, who was from South Carolina, didn't like Florida very much and said, "If you can get a job back in the Carolinas, I would very much appreciate it." All of her family lived up there. So I started looking around again, but I didn't want to work in Columbia again because the only station that I really cared about was one that had basically fired the news staff right after I left. So I said, if I can get a job in Charlotte, then we can move back to the Carolinas. Well, luckily, a friend of mine who I had worked with in Columbia, Scott Kilgore, had come to Charlotte working at WBT. And so he said, "We have an FM station here that is looking for a news person for a morning team they have called John Boy and Billy. And we'd like to get your foot in the door here. They're looking for a news director for that." And I said, "Okay." And so I came up and interviewed for the job and got it. And so that was my first experience in working in Charlotte radio was working with John Boy and Billy on the FM. But within a year, they had split up, and the FM wasn't really a good vehicle for a news department. We only had 2 people, morning and afternoon. I was a morning guy. And then the WBT AM news director at that time was Scott White. And he asked me if I'd like to come over after my first year over on the FM side. I said, sure, and I was in the same newsroom. I didn't really go anywhere because the FM and the AM shared newsrooms, so I was just working behind a different microphone for the basically the same company, and spent the next 31 years at WBT Radio in the newsroom there. So those are my 4 major news markets that I've worked in: New Jersey, Columbia, South Carolina, Orlando, Florida, and Charlotte. And so at WBT, I might have done a few newscasts on the weekend here and there, but primarily my job was as a news reporter. So I was doing street work, covering things like local government, crime, spot news, you name it. And that's pretty much what I did, and did that for quite a while until later I started doing more in-house work, including a regular newscast shift, and finally was pulled off the street altogether because I was doing more kind of administrative stuff, and eventually became news director towards the last part of my tenure at BT. And I did that up until last October of 2016, at which time I finally ended my tenure with WBT.
What are some moments that you remember most in your career, specifically with WBT? Well,
if you're talking about things that I covered, I would say there were certain events which definitely stand out. A lot of local I guess, news-related events that stand out in my mind are the kinds of things that happen as, spot news kind of things, like Hurricane Hugo when it came through back in '89. We were all sort of assigned various duties because everybody knew that Hugo was going to come to the Carolinas. We didn't realize it was going to come all the way to Charlotte. But my job the night that it was to come ashore was to be in Georgetown, South Carolina. We had people in Charleston. We had people, further up in Wilmington and down the coast towards Beaufort. And as it was, I was in Georgetown, which is about 30 miles north of where that hit. So I was covering the storm from there, and then thought things were pretty much over after it hit Charleston. And then after getting a couple hours of sleep, the phone rang again. They said, get back to Charlotte. We just got hit by Hugo here. The big story turned out to be in Charlotte, where anyone who was around in 1989 remembers that. Mm-hmm. And suddenly that was really where all the coverage began. And for the next couple of weeks, that was the story in town. Then there were other things that I remember. Well, other things that are national events that stand out, like the Challenger disaster, 9/11, and so forth. But the local type stories that I did cover that were very memorable was the Hamlet fire, Hamlet, North Carolina, Imperial Food chicken plant fire, 1991, which killed 25 people, all because they had locked the doors on the outside and plant workers couldn't get out. And then there was the U.S. Air Flight 1016 crash back in 1994, right there at the airport. As it turned out, my wife and I it was July 2nd, and we had just gone out to eat, and we came back to the Overlook, where, people go and watch planes, and we just happened to notice a thunderstorm that was approaching. And my wife said, we better get back home because the dog's outside. We don't want the dog to get wet. So as the storm was approaching, we were driving back to our house on the east side, and about halfway there, we noticed a lot of police cars, with lights flashing, going back in the direction of the airport. Didn't realize it at the time, but about 5 minutes after we left, when the storm hit the airport, this U.S. Air DC-9 encountered a wind shear and tried to do a go-around, but the shear pushed it to the ground right about maybe a quarter mile from the Overlook, where we had been just a few minutes earlier, and I didn't know about it until I got home and had to turn right around and go back and start doing reporting for that. That was a very, very sad incident. I think about 37 people were killed in that crash. But that was one where I'm sort of actively involved in the coverage of that event. Other things, just typical news events, but did a lot of government reporting, and I kind of gauged my time in the department by various news stories that I covered. So it'd be hard to chronicle everything because there's so much that happened in the last 30 years. The growth of Charlotte Hornets, the Carolina Panthers, and so forth. So it's been, it was a very, very interesting period of news in Charlotte when I got here and until the time I left. It sort of turned, when Charlotte turned from a kind of a sleepy but rather large town, but not much going on, to a booming, almost Atlanta-like town, if you measured it against Atlanta, say, 30 years ago. And so it was interesting. There was never a dull moment. In all the time that I worked at WBT. I can't remember a time where I was bored. It was always interesting.
I want to go back a little bit to where you were talking about Hurricane Hugo, and you said you went to sleep and got a call a couple hours later, and they said get back to Charlotte because Hugo hit here. Did you have to drive back through the storm to Charlotte, or what did you do?
Well, by then, the eye of the storm had pretty much come and gone. And so I was out at first light, and so I did have to drive back, but I was pretty much driving up along where the eye had traveled, and it was a surreal experience only because somebody had cleared the road probably a half an hour before I got there in my news car, did I get back to Charlotte, in a reasonable amount of time, because there were, I would see trees across the road, but somebody had cut them, just so the cars could get through. Somebody would push a tree off the road. There was no power all the way from the coast of South Carolina up to Charlotte, and that meant that no gas stations were open, and there were no street lights, and this was the situation all the way up to Charlotte. And then I saw what they meant when they called me on the phone and said the big story is here, because when I finally got to Charlotte, not without having been stuck a few times behind lines of cars or having to make little detours because of things down on the road, I saw just what was a very, very storm-damaged city getting onto Highway 74, Independence Boulevard around Monroe, all the way in. Street lights and power poles were all sort of leaning in towards the highway or off towards the road, off the side of the road, and flags were in tatters, and the wind was still blowing, and it was just a mess. Anybody who was around remembers it. And it was so strange because it was so far inland for what turned out to be hurricane force winds as they hit Charlotte to damage a city the size of Charlotte so far inland. It was totally unexpected. Everybody had figured if it was going to hit Charlotte, by the time it got into town, it might be about 50, 60 mile an hour winds, but they came through still hurricane force and then some at about 90 and low 90 mile per hour sustained winds. It was pretty bad damage. Anybody who was there remembers it, and that's what I came back to after spending the night in a courthouse in Georgetown, just listening to the wind blow hard and the rain hit the side of the building. But damage in Charlotte was a lot worse.
Yeah, I remember sitting or laying in the bathroom of my parents' house as a 9-year-old little boy, and my brother laying in the bathtub, and my mom and dad cramped, in the floor, and the bathroom's not a real big place. I don't know how we fit in there, but I remember just having the little radio there tuned to WBT and listening to WBT all night long, listening to the winds howl, wondering if the house was gonna blow away, and pretty terrifying for a kid, maybe even for my parents, but
I'm sure. In fact, I got a call from my wife in the morning around the same time I had talked to the radio station, and she had this sort of sound to her voice as if she was trying to not scare my daughter, who was 3 years younger than you at the time. She was 6, and our house had already been hit by a tree, and the wind was still blowing, and she was sort of, oh, yes, everything's fine here. We're in the bathroom, and then we were in the hallway earlier and had a little trouble with a tree hitting the house. All the while, my daughter was in there sort of, Mommy, what's going on? Are we going to be okay?
Right.
So yeah, it sounds like you and she and many others in Charlotte were going through the same thing as kids. That was a big story to cover. Yeah, well, I didn't know at the time. I didn't realize that they were in any danger. I thought I was the one that was going to be in danger. Turns out that I was in probably the strongest place I could have been, a big old stone courthouse along the coast in Georgetown, which resisted any and all damage and survived in one piece. But everything else around there was crazy.
That's the great thing about radio, is it really, it reaches out to people, especially in times like that, and you can get emergency and time-sensitive information out. No other medium, really. I mean, Twitter maybe, or some social media these days, but what do you do if the phone lines are down? And there you go, there's the radio.
Although nowadays, if most people, it seems like they've long since abandoned their old transistor radios, and it's hooked up either to their phone or their car. You wonder what's going to happen the next time we lose power. Where are people going to get their unless it's on their iPhones?
I still have a radio in the bathroom. My wife can tell you in the morning I get up and turn on the radio, and it's usually on WBT, because I tell her I want to see if Charlotte is still there, so that I can drive into work safely in the morning.
I tell you, radio, it's still a relevant medium. You talk about social media, and radio still is theater of the mind. It's live, a bit more civil than social media, and you can always rely on its spontaneity. Sometimes social media suffers from it's less like a conversation really than radio. But having worked in the radio business all my life, I know the advantages. Not to say that it doesn't have lots of challengers in the media marketplace today, but it is still a unique medium, and I think one that is around to stay, unless I'm wrong.
What are you most proud of from your career in radio, Jim?
It's funny because I'm sort of biased towards myself, but and the things that I would say I'm proud of, I don't know that they would mean anything to other people, but was surviving my career in radio without being fired, except right up at the very end when I was a result of a downsizing. Just so happened it was right at the end of my career. So I sort of look at it as like, well, okay, had to end somehow. But it's a volatile business. A lot of people don't make a career out of it. They spend some time there and then they move on to other maybe related fields, public information, that sort of thing. But I guess I took pride in the fact that over all those years, close to 40 years, I managed to survive ever having just being fired for various reasons. Came close early on and then managed to survive many different management changes where people would come in and I would watch people who I worked with disappear for various reasons, not always because they were not good employees, but just it's the nature of the business. People come and go, and they let people go for various reasons. But I guess I was just proud not to have been fired all those years. I could have been me. It's just for the grace of God, something happened, and I got to stay, and so it became a very. I forgot that I was in a volatile profession. I felt very secure in it for a long time, but it's not always that kind of business. So I guess I was pretty lucky.
What does it take to be a good reporter?
Well, I tell you, news reporting is pretty interesting, and you have to remember that you are there you're really just telling the story. You're a mouthpiece, and so you have to resist injecting yourself into the story. Sometimes that's impossible because people say, "Okay, you're there. Tell us what your impressions were," and all that sort of thing. But really, you're trying your best to just convey the facts of the story in a way that really does justice to what has happened. I mean, if it's not that big of a story, you don't want to build it up into something that it wasn't, which happens a lot in the business. I'm sure everybody can think of examples. But you really kind of have to just pay attention, be a good observer, and it's almost like if you have children, and I know you do, but when you start telling stories to them when they're very young, you want to emphasize the important parts of the story in a way that doesn't bore them to death. And so that's kind of like news writing in a very elementary sort of comparison way. You point out who the good players are, maybe who the bad actors are, try to put in all the important detail, and then make it interesting and convey it in a way that reaches out to people in a way that they can understand, so sort of relating to a story from a personal perspective. And that's probably the best advice that I would be able to give to any young reporter is just resist the impulse to inject yourself into the story and just try to convey the facts in a manner that people can relate to in their own human experience in such a way that doesn't minimize something that might be tragic or overarching and doesn't maximize details just for the sake of taking up time. Say, hey, give us a minute and a half, Jim. Okay, well, I'm just going to throw in a bunch of details that don't mean anything. Nobody cares about stuff like that. Just focus on what's important, and the story usually can tell itself if you're a good observer, and you can just pick out what people want to hear. Everybody has an opinion, and it's a challenge, especially when you deal in political stories, because everybody has their own beliefs, including news reporters, and the challenge is to remember that you're only one person. There are probably at least 50% of the listeners out there who don't have your opinion or don't share your opinion, so don't just put yours out there as if it's the only one or it's the primary one, because it's tempting. I mean, you see it in journalism. You see the way stories are reported, and sometimes, unfortunately, it comes across that people are more likely to be just airing a viewpoint on a story as opposed to just telling the story. And it's a human tendency, and it's a human failing that many journalists have. And I've made mistakes in those areas over the years. And you just you try to learn from those mistakes, because people, you get feedback, and people say, I heard you tell that story, and it sounded to me like you were injecting your own opinion into the story. And so they were probably right when that happened. And so you just have to resist that, because it's a temptation once you get the microphone. Like, well, I want my side represented, but you can't do that. It's just. You have to be careful. I did try always to be fair. I'm sure there were times where I failed, but that's the big challenge is in trying to get people to pay attention to a particular radio station or your news is make sure that it's fairly reported. So that's what we try to do. Some people might disagree that we're always successful at it, but hopefully we've always been able to try to keep it down the middle of the road. It's tough. It really is tough because people are people, and they're always going to be subject to their own whims and want to get their opinion. It's just human nature. It's human nature.
Was there a time other than Hurricane Hugo, for instance, like a story you covered where you felt, wow, I'm kind of in danger here. I need to move to a different location or need to get out of here before things go really bad?
The only time, really, because the first responders get there, their primary concern is make sure that doesn't happen to anybody. And, the reporters are generally the ones that show up next. You have the police and the ambulance and firefighters, not necessarily in that order, but generally those are the ones who are the first responders. And then, the media finds out about it and we show up. And the police at that point or the firefighters have already decided, okay, this area is not safe or this area is. So why don't you set up we'll have a sort of a media area over here. And they already know that the wind's blowing, the other way so that you're not in the line of, let's say there's a chemical spill or a fire somewhere. They're not going to have you set up downwind of the fire, But I tell you, in response to your question, I mean, those kinds of stories, chemical spills or fires, it always bothered me because, the winds can change. And if there's some sort of chemical spill or, ammonia cloud somewhere and the wind changes, you're out of luck or, you're breathing smoke or something else. So that was one I always hated going out on those stories, the smoke and fire and industrial accident kind of stories. Just for that very reason. I never had a problem with it, but, things can happen. Some of those big fires, if you get there early enough, you never know you might get a snoot full of smoke before it's all over.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you one last question here, and it's a bit of a curveball, but it's not a bad curveball. So do you have any predictions on the Cincinnati Reds' chances to get to the playoffs this coming season?
Yeah, I do, as a matter of fact. I would say their chances are probably about 1%. And that is after careful consideration of the National League Central Division, which is stocked with 4 better teams than the Reds, starting with the Cubs and the Cardinals. And so, unfortunately, for non-baseball fans, this is sort of esoteric talk, but the Reds, they've been in a real down spiral where they've been selling off all their talent and trying to build from youth, but it's just not working very well. So I would say the Reds are not going to have they'll probably finish last, I would say, again, in their division.
We've talked a lot about some serious stuff, so I wanted to end on a lighter note. And
Yeah. Well, listen, that doesn't mean I'm not going to enjoy watching the Reds. I grew up in Cincinnati. I don't think I ever mentioned that, but that was where I got into baseball and been a Reds fan from way back. I like some other teams, but I always default to Cincinnati. So I hope they do well. I'm a big baseball fan, so I enjoy watching whoever plays. So I hope the Braves do well, just because in the Southeast I know they're pretty big. So they'll be playing in a new stadium, and maybe that'll give them a little bit of a boost since they finished last in their division last year too.
Well, Jim, it's been great talking to you. Thanks for taking the time. I want to be respectful of your time and not take too much of it. But really appreciate you being there and making yourself available. And it's been really fun listening to you on the radio since I was a really young kid. And a lot of times you don't think about, hey, one day I'm going to get to talk to the guy on the radio or have lunch with the guy on the radio. So it's neat to take some time with you and find out more about your career and how you have flourished as a reporter and a broadcast journalist.
Well, thank you, Nathan. I very much appreciate it. It's flattering to be considered. We in the business, we sort of like to think of ourselves as being important in some way, but we're really just no different and better than anybody else. We're just more visible, or you can hear us more than other people. But I tell you the truth, we're just people like everybody else, and hopefully, if we do get attention, it's not for something bad that we've said or done, but it's for trying to do a good job and get the news out to people, and that's what we try to do. That's what I try to do. So I'm glad I made it that long, and I very much appreciate taking the time to call and ask me about my job over the years. It was a lot of fun, and truly, I met a lot of wonderful people along the way. I wouldn't have traded it for anything. So for anyone out there, whoever ever we crossed paths or you heard me, I was always trying to reach the listener out there, and hopefully did a decent job at it. So thank you.
Well, from this listener's point of view, you did an excellent job, and I look forward to talking to you again sometime, and let's do lunch again.
Indeed. I very much enjoyed it, and good luck to you and your family. I know that you and parenthood are headed on a collision course there, so that's going to be lots of fun for you.
It definitely will. Thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you.
God bless. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.
I certainly had a great time talking to Jim, finding out about his career and his love of radio. We certainly wish Jim and his family well in his retirement. That wraps up this episode of Incredible Stories. I'm your host, Nathan Mackey. Today's theme song was called The Idol by Voda Vose, and I chose it because I'm a big fan of 80s music. Check out the link below in the video player if you want to hear more music by that artist. Thanks so much for listening, and until next time, have a great day.